Hi, this is David Roth. Since March, I've been working with our colleague David Baker on new bylaws for CPSP. What that really means is that we've been about the business of reforming and improving our community's governance. The guiding principle in this work has been to hold on to the most important aspects of what we know as CPSP life, the CPSP experience. The covenant is what everybody comes back to. No one we've spoken to has said to us that we should get rid of the covenant or even change it. The other hinge upon which our work has rested and turned is this marvelous thing called the chapter. The chapter is where most of us experience CPSP life. It's how and where we live out the covenant. And by the way, no one has suggested that we get rid of the chapter either. CPSP members cherish the covenant and chapter life. So what have we done? If we take as our starting point what we refer to as the 2009 bylaws, the ones that are in effect now, we find that it's simply not possible to govern by them. Back in the early days of CPSP, everybody knew everybody. It was a small community. It wasn't too hard to govern back then. But we grew to be very large, and the growth was very quick. And the truth is that our 2009 bylaws were already out of date in 2009. So what's the problem with them? Well, the governing council is supposed to include a representative from each chapter, usually the convener, and each chapter convener is expected to be part of a decision-making body, the board of directors. With over 100 chapters, you can see how complex and cumbersome and expensive simply having a meeting would become. Even if we could get everyone together, which we can't, it's hard to manage such a group so that everyone has a voice and things get done. In reality, barely more than maybe a dozen or so chapters, if that were ever represented. And under the 2009 bylaws, there is no obligation for chapters to participate in governance at all. This resulted in some chapters essentially opting out, living on their own island far away from the larger community of CPSP, with little accountability and virtually no responsibility. Some, I think it's fair to say, were attached to little more than a certification process. I myself was a chapter convener attending the governing council meetings 3 or 4 years ago. As I mentioned, the turnout was dismal. As CPSP membership and the number of chapters boomed, the chapters became proportionally less involved in the governing council, and the executive committee took on more responsibility and exercised greater authority. The result was that to anyone reading the bylaws, it became clear that the way we were governing was not the way we said on paper that we should. And in fact, it wasn't possible to do so. 2 or 3 years ago, I put forward a proposal for new governance. It was in Pastoral Report and even presented at NCTS in the East. There have been at least 3 or 4 additional proposals since then. None of these was ever adopted. At the plenary gathering in Virginia Beach this past March, David Baker and I were charged with working something out that would be true to our identity as CPSP and workable. Something representative that fosters the principles of the covenant and chapter life, something that promotes transparency in governance and effective communication, along with the high standards that were at the core of the founding of CPSP 25 years ago. We were asked to draft new bylaws for our CPSP community, and now we've done that. What we've done is modified our existing form of governance. We didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We didn't try to start from scratch. We asked questions about how to fix what wasn't working. Starting from our strengths as a community, we looked at where our governance was weak. Then we went about the business of trying to strengthen the weaknesses while building up upon our strengths. What we've come up with did not just come out of our 2 heads. It came from listening, it came from talking with others, and much of the listening had been done for us over the past couple of years. A lot of that work that was done by previous governance task forces is reflected in our work. We've learned from their hard work, and we're in their debt. We knew, for example, that there had to be a way for chapters to be represented in the governance process, and that merely extending an invitation for chapters to send a representative to a twice-yearly meeting was not enough. We also recognized that as the membership of CPSP has shifted from being all diplomates in the early days, and all chapters of diplomates back then, to what we have now, which is a membership made up of mostly non-diplomates and chapters of clinicians, not supervisors or psychotherapists, we knew that, as a result, new bylaws for reflecting the role of diplomates as a vital core of CPSP would have to be represented. We also recognize this. For a quarter of a century, we've been an all-volunteer organization. That is, with the exception of having a part-time administrative assistant. I think as a community, we believe in what the covenant says about traveling light and not owning any property, but at the same time, we've grown so large and so complex that getting things done takes more than a few hours volunteered here and there by a handful of people. Over and over again, we've heard people say to us that they believe there's a real need for the reliable consistency that only professional staff can provide, and we agree, and this is reflected in the new governance proposal. So let me explain this new design for CPSP governance. The newly proposed bylaws, which are a revision of the 2009 ones, create a governing council made up of 3 chapters, if you will. One is a chapter of chapters, the second a chapter of diplomates, and the third is what we're calling the executive chapter. These are 3 chapters that each have 6 members in them. The chapter of chapters is made up of 6 representatives, each being a chapter convener representing a cluster of chapters. Every chapter would be obligated through their convener to have a relationship with other chapters represented by their conveners in their cluster. Clusters of chapters would be more or less, but not strictly regional. The 6 clusters would each choose one of the conveners to represent them and serve in the chapter of chapters on the governing council. Next, there's the chapter of diplomates. This body of 6 would be chosen at large by diplomates to represent all diplomates. There would be no candidates, no campaigning. Rather, each diplomate would submit the names of those fellow diplomates who they would like to see representing their interests and concerns on the governing council. There would be proportional representation based upon the ratio between the CPE supervisor diplomates and the psychotherapist diplomates in CPSP. The third chapter, the executive chapter, is a modified version of the present executive committee or so-called leadership team. The details of how this group is constituted are more complex than the chapter of chapters and the chapter of diplomates. For me to go through all of the details here would be tedious and maybe even a bit confusing. Let me just outline the key points about the executive chapter. The fine details are spelled out in the proposed bylaws very clearly, and I encourage you to look at them. We've maintained the practice of having a CEO-type person known as a general secretary, along with the president. CPSP over the course of 25 years has benefited from the continuity of having a catalyst visionary CEO, which we call the general secretary. We've also benefited from having what our documents describes as the gracious and public face of CPSP, a president whose term is limited and who, because of this strictly limited term, brings a variety of perspectives and fresh blood to CPSP leadership as new presidents come and go. So we haven't eliminated one or the other, as some may have suggested that we should. Let me say just a few words about these roles. Many of us from the United States think in terms of our national government where the president is the chief executive. For those who are unfamiliar with this concept that we have, the general secretary, the term itself even can sound odd. I should point out, however, that the idea of having a chief executive and also one called a president who is not a chief executive officer is not original to CPSP. The World Council of Churches, for example, is headed by a general secretary. So are a number of Christian and other religious bodies. And there are many governing bodies throughout the world that have both a prime minister, for example, and a president. Raymond Lawrence has filled the general secretary role since day one in CPSP, but he won't do that forever. The general secretary role is not a person, though the one to come after Raymond will have enormous shoes to fill. It is instead a key role distinct from that of the president, and thus we've chosen to keep both, since the complementary roles, these 2 distinct roles, have served us well in the past. The general secretary and the president are members of the executive chapter, along with the treasurer. To round out the executive chapter, 3 of the 6 standing committee chairs, which we have designated, concerned with the essential functions of CPSP life, the accreditation function, accreditation, certification of individuals, promotion, certification of chapters, ethics, communications, and standards. 3 of these will be part of the executive chapter at any given time. The other 3 serve as consultants to the executive chapter and the governing council. All 6 form a sort of cabinet. So this is how it would look. One more thing. I mentioned paid staff. For the General Secretary and the Executive Chapter to function, to do their work from day to day, and also to do so effectively and responsibly, and for the Governing Council meetings to be well prepared for, with proper planning and coordination to take place with the Chapter of Diplomates and the Chapter of Chapters, it's essential that someone be working from day to day for the community of CPSP as their primary responsibility. That's why, as many of you have told David Baker and me, we need a paid staff person. This person would not be an executive director because that sort of role doesn't really fit with who we as CPSP have been as a community. We conceive of this role as something of a chief of staff. The administrator would work for the Governing Council and be accountable to it, from day to day reporting to and assisting the General Secretary, coordinating among members of the Executive Chapter. A very important responsibility for this person would be coordinating between all 3 chapters that make up the Governing Council in planning and preparation for Governing Council meetings. Many of the nuts and bolts necessary to work out our new governance, we expect, will be hashed out over the coming months. Bylaws are not meant to spell out all the details, but to lay a framework. Our hope is that we will discuss and adopt this new form of governance at the fall Governing Council to come. Our hope is that on the occasion of the 25th anniversary plenary in 2015, which is also the 50th anniversary of Anton Boysen's death, we'll be well along the way toward implementing this new form of governance. So on behalf of the 2 of us, David Baker and myself, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for your help and support, your patience, as we've been working on these new bylaws. No form of government is perfect. Whenever there are competing interests among those who share a common vision and common aims, some compromise must take place to achieve what is important for lasting good. David and I expect that over time changes to these bylaws will and should be made. They are not perfect. We believe, however, that they set us in the right direction. They meet our present needs and they offer us a way forward that respects our history and tradition, as well as the profound changes over time that we've experienced and will continue to experience. Read the new bylaws. Share them with your chapters. We look forward to chapter conveners turning out for the Governing Council meeting this fall. And lastly, I, and David as well, want to thank you for the trust you've placed in us and for this opportunity to serve.